Hello and welcome to one of logicalenglish.com's more specific lessons. Today the subject is gerunds and infinitives. Yeah, I know, a subject we all love dearly, I'm sure. Before we get on to it, I'll mention a few points. To get the most from this lesson, please don't forget to do a couple of things. Firstly, if you haven't watched the core 4 lessons in the Logical English series, please head on back to the website and watch those, because they really do provide the logical framework within which we understand the more specific details of the language. Secondly, if you haven't already done so, please again head on back to the website and download and print a study guide. Not only will this allow better comprehension of what's happening, but also my handwriting can sometimes be a little bit tricky to follow. So one of those study guides will help enormously. Also, if you find this lesson useful, please head back to the website and give a small donation so I can keep this whole website going. But let's get on to things now. Gerunds versus infinitives, they've always been a problem for both students and teachers. They seem to be so full of exceptions. They seem to be just, well, not even exceptions, just a memory game. So we'll try and understand it in a slightly more this subject in a slightly more logical way. Before we do so, let's take a look at the precise nature of the problem. So let's begin by taking a look at some examples of the problem that students are facing, and these examples contain some accuracies and inaccuracies that would be presented by typical students. Here we go. We've got, well, I stopped talking to her. Which one's right there? I imagine sitting, to sit on a beach. Which do you choose? I like to walking in the park. Well, you've probably always been taught that you can choose either of them. Neither of them's a problem. Well, hopefully I'll teach you today that actually there is a difference there, and it'll get you some nice big points in IELTS or Cambridge as well. The final one, I went to town. Well, is it buying some clothes or to buy some clothes? Which is right here? Before we start having a look at some reasons and rationale behind all of this, let's just remind ourselves of some previous knowledge that we learned. So let's take a look at some information we learnt way back in well, I believe it was core lesson number 1, number 1 of the core 4 lessons, all associated with the terminology and what words we use to describe different verbs and different word forms. So let's just remind ourselves of that. Well, so we've got these different styles: to take, took, taken, taking, taking again. So what do we call those? Can you remember? Let's take a look. Well, we call take the base form, took the past form, taken the past participle, taking the present participle, and really to take and taking shouldn't really even be on this list, because the base form, past participle and present participle, well, we often refer to those as number 1, number 2, number 3, and I would even argue that the present participle should be referred to as number 4, but for some reason we don't. We just use we just refer to them as 1, 2 and 3. Take, took, taken, for example. So to take and taking, can you remember what they are? Well, there's a big clue right at the top of the screen. To take is what we call an infinitive. It's basically the base form with to added on. Okay? So whether that's to run, to walk, to think, to listen, to write, you get the idea. And taking down here, that's what we call a gerund. And I want to remind you at this point, something that we've looked at briefly before. Infinitives and gerunds are not verbs. They are nouns. And we've looked at a couple of examples previously, but let's just remind ourselves of them. We've got, for example, I like to walk. I like walking. And so we've got, for example, we've got three components to this small sentence here. I is the subject. We've got like as the main verb, in fact as the only verb. And the object in this sentence is to walk or walking. And an object is a noun or a noun phrase. In this case, a noun down here, or to walk would be a noun phrase. If we shift the gerund of the infinitive to become the subject, well then we've got walking is fun. You could also say, I mean it's rare, but you could say to walk is fun. We've got, well, the object, well actually it's the adjective over here. You could consider it the object, of course. You've got the verb to be in the middle, and well, right at the front you've got the subject, and of course the subject is a noun or a noun phrase. So hopefully I've proved there that an infinitive and a gerund, they're both nouns, they are not verbs. Anyone that tries to tell you any differently is, I'm afraid, wrong, and now you can give them some examples and show them why they're wrong. So if we now return to the examples of the problems that we were looking at earlier, we've been through them already before. Let's start having a look at what's right and what's wrong here. First of all, I stopped talking to her. Which one's definitely wrong there? Well, hopefully you can see that to talking is not even a possibility according to our word list that we just saw. To talking could not happen at all. So it's I stopped. So the only possibility here is I stopped talking to her. I imagine sitting on a beach. I imagine to sitting on a beach. Well, the correct one here is sitting. I imagine to sit on a beach is not a possibility in this case. I like to walk. I like walking in the park. Well, they're both correct. I went to town to buy some clothes. Which one's right? Many Spanish and Portuguese speakers might want to say I went to town buying some clothes, but that's wrong. I went to town to buy some clothes. So okay, we've got a little bit deeper here, but we still haven't answered any questions about the rationale or why things are like this. And I taught gerunds versus infinitives as a memory thing for years, until continued requests from students to, as I always say, the best question to ask in any class is why, and that led me to come up with what we're about to have a look at. It's not a series of rules, but it is a series of concepts that hopefully should be able to help you. They've, my students have certainly told me they've certainly been able to help them, especially if you're in a tight spot in an exam. Let's take a look at them. So let's take a look at some of these concepts, and I'll stress again, concepts, not rules, to help you. There's going to be a lot of information coming up on the screen right now, but I encourage you to remember that we will be having a look at each of these concepts individually, and we'll be having a look at some examples for each one, so don't panic about all the information that's coming up. So the first one, well, do you know what? Actually, this one is a rule. And we've seen it before. It's not just a concept, it's a rule that you must use in English. After a preposition, you must use a noun phrase. And that's something always worth remembering when using English. The next one. Very often in English, reasons are given using infinitives. I can't stress enough how important that one is. It is amazingly important, and it's very often problematic for Spanish and Portuguese speakers. So very often reasons are given using infinitives, and we'll see some examples of that in just a moment. Number 3. This is a strange one. It feels strange to native speakers to follow a preposition with something that feels like a preposition. Now we've seen that an infinitive is to plus the base form. Now we're going to see it a little bit later, but that to, it's not a preposition. When it's part of an infinitive, it's one thing. It's to plus base form. That's not to plus base form. That's an infinitive, and so is one thing. But it does feel like a preposition. We'll see some examples in a moment, but the rule, the concept for this is avoid following a preposition with an infinitive. The next concept. Gerunds and infinitives, as we've just seen, they're both nouns. However, well, gerunds are a bit more nouny, and infinitives are just a bit more kind of verby. Final concept. If the verb can be followed by what we'd call a pure noun, something like cat, or a cat, a picture, some grass, a house, something that you can, touch and really, has a solidity to it. So if the verb can be followed by a pure noun, then when choosing, and forgive me here, I'm running out of space, when choosing a gerund or an infinitive, you'll probably need a gerund. And that relates to concept number 4, where gerunds are just a bit more nouny. Let's have a look at some of these individually. So let's take a look at some examples of each of these concepts. And the first one being, after a preposition, you must use a noun phrase. And as I mentioned previously, this isn't even really a concept. This is just a hard rule in English that you must stick to. Let's take a look at some examples here. I was talking about, well, what is it? Her, see her, saw her, seeing her. Which of those might be correct? Well, see her and saw her, see and saw, well, we've got a base form here, number 1. We've got past form here, that's verb form number 2. So they're verbs. They don't work. But her, as a pronoun, is a noun phrase, although it's only one word. That works fine. Seeing her, well, seeing, that's a gerund. So there's no problem there either. So it is absolutely fine here to say I was talking about, let's remove those, I was talking about her, I was talking about seeing her. Neither of those present any kind of problem. Let's have a look at another very similar example. I'll give you a chance to figure it out yourself. I was thinking of my motorbike, ride my motorbike, rode my motorbike, riding my motorbike. Have a think about it for a moment. See what answers you can come up with. And I hope here you've been able to come up with the same conclusions that I have, that two of them again are possible, 2 of them are impossible. We've got verb structures for ride my motorbike and rode my motorbike, but My motorbike, well, that's a very good noun phrase. And riding my motorbike. Okay, we're emphasizing the riding of the thing as opposed to just imagining the thing itself. But yeah, it's absolutely fine. We've got a good noun phrase beginning with a gerund here. And if we want to prove it, we could even put it as the as the subject of the sentence. So, for example, riding my motorbike is fun, and that would present no problems at all. So let's take a look at the next concept number 2. And it's very often in English, reasons are given using an infinitive. And as I mentioned before, this is an extremely common translation error for both Spanish and Portuguese speakers. Let's have a look at an example of what I mean by this. I went to the shops. Why? Well, to buy some clothes. The to buy is the reason for me going to the shops. Let's take a look at another example and you can complete it for yourself. He spoke to me. Why? I'll give you a moment to think up, to complete that sentence in any way you choose. But here's my completion of it. So we're going to continue with an infinitive so we can give the reason. To tell me a secret. So in both of those cases, to buy and to tell, following our main clause, we're giving reasons. We're saying why using an infinitive. Okay. Let's take a look at concept number 3. So the next concept number 3. Here we go. Let's take a look. It feels strange to native speakers. Of course, we're talking native speakers of English here. It feels strange to native speakers to follow a preposition with something that feels like a preposition. So avoid following a preposition with an infinitive. As I mentioned before, infinitives are composed of the preposition to plus the base form. But when they come together as an infinitive, they're no longer a preposition and a base form. They are one unit called an infinitive. But nonetheless, that word to in an infinitive still kind of feels like a preposition. And so if we've got, I don't know, let's take a look at some examples. If we've got, for example, she is skilled. Well, which preposition, well, she is skilled, I apologize, and I'm good. Which preposition attaches itself to these verbs? Let's get those done now. She is skilled at. She is skilled, we're skilled at something. What preposition goes with apologize? I apologize for something. And I'm good, well actually it's the same as skilled. I'm good at something. So now we've got the prepositions in place. Now we've just got to decide, well, what's the, are we going to use the gerund or an infinitive? So we've got the prepositions in place. So according to concept number 3, we'll avoid following these prepositions with an infinitive. So we're going to use a gerund. She is skilled at, well, for example, writing. I apologize for, well, I mean, you can complete it in any way you choose using a gerund, but I've got, I apologize for shouting at you. And finally, I'm good at swimming. So after all of these prepositions which have attached themselves to the verbs, we're going to be using a gerund. Okay? Let's go and take a look at the... I'll just mention also that this does seem to be, I've noticed in the past that this seems to be a big stumbling block, quite a big problem for French speakers. So all you French speakers out there, be careful of this. And while we're on the subject, if for you Japanese and Korean and Russian speakers out there that are thinking, hey, yeah, but what about us? Well, I'm sorry, it's just all difficult for you. Sorry about that. Let's take a look at the next one. Now, in fact, before we move on to the next concept, it's just occurred to me that this is probably quite a good time to mention something about prepositions that might help you out. Let's face it, for language learners, they are horrible things to have to try and remember. We've mentioned many times before that there are 126 of the things, and they all attach to different verbs and different adjectives in different ways, and they're just a nightmare. But you can help yourself by using what you already know. Let's take a look at what I mean by that. If we take the sentence, she is good at writing. Well, we've got she is good, okay, and then as we saw in the previous slide, the preposition which attaches to good is at, and then we're following it with the gerund. So if you're writing something like she is, I don't know, bad, well, which preposition attaches to bad? It's going to be the same one. Anything that refers to her quality of being able to do something will use the same preposition. Good at, bad at. We can use great at writing, fantastic at writing, as we saw previously, skilled at writing. All of these words, all adjectives which describe her quality, they're going to use the same preposition. So if you're in an exam, for example, and you've got something like this, if you can think of a word that has a similar meaning, it's likely to want to use the same preposition. We'll take a look at one more example. Those were adjectives there. Let's take a look at a verb. I depend on you. Well, can anyone think of a verb which means something similar to depend? And I'm going to suggest rely. So if you were to go into an exam and see I rely space you, and it asked you, well, which preposition goes in this place? You know that rely means the same as depend, and you know that depend attaches to the preposition on, and so rely is going to use the same preposition. So all the time with prepositions, I can't guarantee this, but it's again a reasonable concept to have it as part of your weaponry. If you can think of a similar word that you know the preposition for, then the word you're looking for, then the word you have in your mind will probably require the same preposition. So when it comes to prepositions, use what you already know. Okay? So let's have a look at that next concept. Okay, you know what? I'm going to delay things a little bit more again, and just to completely clarify things, I'm going to say a brief word about infinitives. I know I just said a brief word about prepositions, but well, this won't take too long. Just to clarify something, an infinitive is formed of two things. I mentioned this briefly earlier. The word to and a base form. For example, to take. The word to is in an infinitive looks like a preposition, but it is not. The two words form one grammatical item. I mean, what we said earlier about prepositions, concept number one, right? That they show a relationship between two noun phrases. Well, the word to, when it's part of an infinitive, clearly does nothing of the sort. It doesn't do that job. So therefore, when it's part of an infinitive, it's not a preposition. And you wouldn't place the word not in the middle of a gerund. You wouldn't say, I am take not ing the bus today. That would be crazy. You'd say, I'm not taking. So in the same way you wouldn't place the word not in the middle of a gerund, avoid doing that in an infinitive. Many people do it, and this used to be a very strict rule, but now not so much. We're quite forgiving about it, but just so as you understand what's going on, avoid doing it. To give you an example, this is why your teacher might sometimes remind you not to split an infinitive. And I'm sure you can see not to split is an example itself of not splitting an infinitive. So and this is opposed to not split. It's not a totally hard rule, and I predict that in 20, 30 more years' time, we won't even bother about this. But right at the moment, if you're sitting in an exam or something like that, avoid splitting your infinitives, because an infinitive, although it's two words, is one grammatical item. Now, finally, let's move on. So on to concept number 4, and we have this one. Gerunds and infinitives, well, they're both nouns. However, gerunds are more nouny, and infinitives are more, well, verby. Now, this concept really attaches to the next one, and we'll get into it in greater depth. But if we take an example, if we're going to use one of these for the subject of a sentence, well, the subject of a sentence is far more likely to be a real kind of more nouny kind of noun phrase. So which one are we going to use? We're going to use a gerund. So for example, learning English, there we go, we've got the noun phrase, is, the verb, a very useful thing, and there we've got the object. So when we're looking for a kind of a more nouny version of the two, we're going to be going for a gerund here. You honestly, you could say to learn English is a very useful thing. There'd be grammatically no problem at all with that. But a native speaker is more likely to use a gerund for a subject because they're just more nouny. So on to the fifth and final concept, and that's this one. If the verb can be followed by a pure noun, then when choosing a gerund or an infinitive, you'll probably require a gerund. Well, why? Don't forget rule number 4, I mean concept number 4, that talks about gerunds just kind of being more nouny. Let's take a look at an example. I can imagine. Well, let's say, for example, I can imagine a cat. You know, if you close your eyes and I say to you, hey, with your eyes closed, in your imagination, can you please, for me now, can you imagine a cat? And you have the image appearing in your head, and so, you know, you can follow imagine with what I would call a pure noun. 2 words, it's a noun phrase, but it's a pure noun idea. Let's take a longer noun phrase. I can imagine an expensive sports car. You know, shut your eyes, you have an image of it in your head. And so we've got 2 pure nouns here, and so if we're going to choose either a gerund or an infinitive, we're going to choose a gerund if we want to follow it by something a little bit more verby. So sitting on a beach, let's take that. I can imagine sitting on a beach. So because I can imagine can be followed by pure nouns, when choosing a gerund or an infinitive, you're going to be choosing a gerund in all likelihood. Doesn't matter how long that gerund phrase is or that noun phrase is, it's going to begin with a gerund. Let's take a look at one more example. Please consider. I don't know, if I say to you, please, well, let's say again, let's put it in plural this time. Please consider cats. You know, if you sit back and think, yes, cats. You know, you have the idea, the concept of a cat in your head, or many cats in your head. I could also say, you know, please consider your health. You know, be aware of it. Be aware of your health. Please consider your health. So we've got please consider being followed by pure nouns. So once again, we're going to be using a gerund should we want to. So if I say to you as a word of advice, hey, please consider eating less sugar. Not please consider to eat less sugar, but please consider eating less sugar, because after consider we can use a pure noun, and if we can use a pure noun we're more likely to use a gerund, because gerunds, well, they're just more nouny. Now, I mentioned this briefly a little bit earlier, and probably left you a little bit puzzled at the time, but I did promise we'd come back to it, and you're not going to like this at all. I promise you that. You've probably always been taught that the word like can be followed by an infinitive or a gerund. Well, here we're going to be having a word about, I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the word like. You've probably always been told that. However, here's a sentence which would make perfect sense to a native speaker, but to a language learner, to an English learner, this is probably very, very confusing for you. Let's take a look at the sentence. I like to swim on Saturday mornings, but I don't like swimming. Now, as I said, to a native speaker of English, there's no problem there at all, but it's probably leaving you scratching your heads. And that's because whereas you might always have been taught that there's no difference between like plus infinitive or like plus gerund, well, now I'm here to say that actually, yes, there is a difference. Let's take a look at that difference. If you use like plus infinitive, you're implying that you think something is a good idea. In this case, I like to swim. Well, all we know about this is that Saturday mornings is a good time for this guy, or for health reasons he thinks it's a good idea. But if you use like plus gerund, now you're referring to just the pure enjoyment of the thing. So when this person says, but I don't like swimming, well, regarding the pure enjoyment of swimming, no, he doesn't like it. But he does think it's a good idea. So once again, I like to swim on Saturday mornings, but I don't like swimming. Makes perfect sense to native speakers, but will probably frustrate you a bit. So just try to remember that like plus infinitive and like plus gerund, they are not the same. Listen out for native speakers using it. Try experimenting with it yourself. Now, there are some incredibly important verbs in English that do operate slightly differently from each other, such as try, stop, remember. That information's out there and freely available for you guys, but the concepts we've gone through today will offer some excellent guidance for you if you're in the middle. For example, if you're in the middle of a use of English section in a Cambridge exam, FC or CAE, or you're writing something in IELTS and you're not sure how to continue it, and if you just don't know which to choose, these concepts offer some very good guidance. So all that leaves me to say is thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to, in the study guide, there's a nice exercise at the end for you to practice what we've learned today. Head on back to the website if you found this lesson useful, and try to contribute something towards the upkeep of the website and production of future lessons. And hey, yes, thank you very much for watching, and keep your eye out for further grammar specific lessons on logicalenglish.com.